Good afternoon. This is Idź.prąd TV, Go Against the Tide. Today is the 7th of April and we are here in our studio in Lublin, Poland. I'm joined by our editor Michał Szczukiewicz.
Hello.
And our weekly guest Alex Newman from USA. Hi Alex.
Hey gentlemen, how are you?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Yeah, we're doing great.
So we recently in Poland we had this LGBT lobby going in strong support for things like sexual education in schools, and not just what has now become a traditional sexual education for these teenagers, but even supporting bizarre things like teaching 4-year-olds masturbation and all kinds of crazy things. I wanted to ask you, because we know that you are expert in education and you've written a book, I think we've seen it behind you there, Crimes of Educators. What are your opinions on sexual education for teenagers and for children? How does that affect their psyche and their development?
Well, what's going on under the guise of sexual education is really not sexual education. It's ideological indoctrination. And we actually just did a whole special report on education in America, urging parents to get their children out of schools. It's here in the New American magazine. You can see Rescuing Our Children. And we have a whole article on this sexualization of the children. Here's one example of what you see. This is from the Drag Queen Story Hour. It's a man dressed as a woman wearing a demon costume with devil horns coming out of his head, reading homosexual stories to little children, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. This has now invaded government schools all across America. You have these men dressed as women going into kindergarten classrooms, first grade, second grade, and then the teachers brag about it on the internet. And this all came from, back in the 1960s and the 1970s, the John Birch Society was highlighting it and warning about the dangers of this sexual education. And we warned that one day they were going to be promoting exactly the kind of stuff we're seeing now. They were promoting already promiscuity, right? They say, everybody is having sex, so you should go and do it. Just make sure you have safe sex, and then everything's fine, right? Well, God told us about sex, and you should not be fornicating. That's a sin. You should not be having sex outside of marriage. But what these schools are teaching the children is that it's totally normal. Everybody's doing it. As long as you use protection, then everything is fine. And that eventually paves the way for what we're seeing now, which is teaching little children about homosexuality, encouraging them to change genders, encouraging them to believe ridiculous ideas like this idea that they might have been born in the wrong body, and maybe they need to take hormones and chop off their genitals to become the other gender. And I mean, this is actually happening. We have a school now in Minnesota that took a child to have a sex change surgery without the permission, against the wishes of the parents. And now there's a lawsuit going on about it, but it's too late. The boy doesn't have his genitals anymore, right? And so this is where all this leads to. And we now have, we reported some time ago in the New American magazine about these new UNESCO sexual education guidelines. They want to start teaching 5-year-old children about homosexuality, about sexual pleasure. They teach them that abortion is a safe, and it needs to be safe and effective and legal and accessible. And all this is happening under the guise of teaching sexual education. So I think it needs to be very clear. We're not talking about sexual education. We're not talking about just explaining the basic biology to children. We are talking about confusing them, indoctrinating them, sexualizing them, grooming them, and in my opinion, it's absolutely criminal. The architects of this are committing crimes against the innocence of children, and parents have a responsibility to protect their children from this, and I hope the Polish people will.
There's quite a strong lobby coming from the LGBT community, and we've actually spoke about this quite a while ago, still when Poland wasn't in the European Union, that under the guise of this LGBT, more sinister things are going to come, like pedophilia and that kind of stuff. Is that the same thing you noticed there, that this LGBT sort of tolerance is being manipulated into more darker things, that it's sort of like the first step and then it follows something much more darker than this?
That's exactly what has happened, Ivan, and I hope the Polish people will pay very close attention to what's happened in other countries. Look what happened in Britain, look what happened in Sweden, look what happened in the United States of America. First, the LGBT lobby said, oh, we just don't want to be discriminated against. We just don't want anybody to be violent against us. Okay, nobody was being violent against you to begin with. But then they say, oh, well, you know, now that we have all these protections, now we want to have a homosexual marriage, right? God already told us what a marriage is. There's no such thing as a homosexual marriage. But the LGBT lobby, as soon as they get 1 inch, then they come for the next inch, and then they go for the whole mile. And what we're seeing now, as you mentioned, Ivan, is the breaking down of the final barrier, which is the taboo against pedophilia. You now have television shows in the United States that are becoming popular, that are promoting, you know, sexual images of naked children, just absolutely horrifying things. You now have articles in so-called mainstream publications trying to normalize and create acceptance for pedophilia. And this is what happens when you abandon biblical morality. See, God has a lot to say about sexuality, about sex. He said God created them male and female. He said homosexual acts are an abomination. And now, in the post-Christian world, you can literally be thrown in jail for quoting the Bible on these issues. If you look in Britain, for example, they now throw pastors in prison for quoting from the Bible what it has to say about homosexuality. If you look in Sweden, they've thrown pastors in jail on multiple occasions. They actually investigated the Bible in 2008, and they decided that it was a violation of their hate speech laws. They said it wasn't practical to ban it right now, but because it talks about homosexuality in a negative way, then it is a violation of the hate speech laws. So that's where all this is going, Ivan. Obviously, Poland is not nearly as far along as some of the other Western countries, but you guys need to be aware. We've seen this movie before, and we know where it goes. You know, we need to be very, very careful about this, and I hope the Polish people will do everything possible to protect their children from this.
And we've also even noticed that some people from the clerical hierarchy of the Catholic Church here have been, you know, leaning and positively expressing their positive opinions about this topic as well. Is that the same in US? Because I know it's a bit different in US with the Catholics and the Protestants. It's not exactly the same as here in Europe. What do you see any leaning from the Catholic Church in US as well towards this?
Well, officially speaking, the Catholic Church still says that homosexual sentiments are disordered and need to be resisted. And in America, to their credit, you know, even though the Catholic hierarchy here, the U.S. Conference of Bishops, for example, is almost always promoting left-wing policies, open borders, government control of healthcare, and so on. But to their credit, they have remained pretty firm on marriage and abortion, that these things are wrong. I hope the same is true in Poland. But, you know, as far as the sex education standards, I haven't seen the Catholic Church doing much speaking out on this, as unfortunate as that is. You know, a lot of Catholics go to Catholic school, and presumably they don't have this kind of filth in Catholic schools. But they have adopted a lot of the stuff that the public schools are doing. About half of Catholic dioceses have now adopted the national education standards, Common Core, that we have here, that are, you know, basically designed to dumb down and indoctrinate and confuse the poor children. So, you know, I've been disappointed with that. And even, unfortunately, a lot of Protestant churches are, you know, a lot of the mainline Protestant denominations in the United States have been captured by the LGBT lobby. They now ordain, you know, so-called homosexual ministers. And, you know, this is problematic from a theological point of view. And unfortunately, we're not seeing as much resistance as, you know, we probably should be seeing from the churches, either Catholic or Protestant.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask you about Conservative Political Action Conference. What are your impressions of the recent CPAC?
Well, you know, Trump's speech was absolutely fantastic. I mean, it was just incredible. And if he continued, you know, I didn't necessarily agree with everything he said, but it was a very good speech. And I think if he runs on that going into 2020, he is going to be in a very good position to win the election unless something catastrophic happens with the economy, which is not out of the question. But CPAC overall, I've become weary of CPAC. You know, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but they invited a homosexual Republican group. It's called, I think, the Log Cabin Republicans or something like this, and they excluded a socially conservative group called Mass Resistance, which has been very, very adamant in resisting exactly what we're talking about here, the sexualization of the children in the schools. I mean, they have really been on the front lines of this battle, and CPAC said they weren't welcome. They couldn't come whereas the homosexual groups could come. So I think there's something very problematic that's infiltrated the so-called conservative establishment. It's not to say that all the groups at CPAC are bad. There's plenty of good groups there, but there's some very problematic elements now. And even though there was a lot of good speeches and a lot of good things happening, I think some real questions about the leadership and its judgment need to be asked.
Okay, which speaker did you like the most, besides President Trump?
Yeah, I think President Trump, I didn't watch all the speeches. I did see, handfuls of them, and I saw news reports on a lot of them. I think Trump did a really good job, and, there's always good conservative speakers there. Michelle Malkin, of course, did a fantastic job. I serve on a board with her, and really, she does just such a good job in articulating so many important things on immigration, on the proper role of government, things like that. But it's a big event, and there's a lot of good things that happen. There are a lot of good speakers that show up there. But I think Trump probably hit the most home runs, and in the conservative media, at least, he got a lot of praise for that. So that was good to see.
That's great. And moving on to our favorite topic, Chinese and the recent Huawei lawsuit against China. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, anybody who's dealing with Huawei needs to be asking very serious questions, because as far as I'm concerned, this is basically an arm of the Chinese military. Why would you build your critical infrastructure with technology that comes from a hostile, mass-murdering communist dictatorship? I don't know, unless you want to deliberately sabotage your country, saving a few dollars here and there on hardware and things worth putting your national security and your infrastructure and your critical systems at risk. I think that's absolutely crazy. So I am glad that there's new awareness about this that's growing, but it's not growing quickly enough. And, it's not just Huawei. It's the Communist Chinese government has now infiltrated and taken over all this whole spectrum of industries. They've been buying up sensitive technology companies from Western Europe, from the United States. Nobody's really been looking at what they're doing until the Trump administration came along. And this is an existential threat. This is one of those things that, if you mess it up here, it's all over, right? The Communist Chinese have been made very, very clear about their desire to kind of rule the world. You have Chinese generals who've talked about nuking hundreds of American cities. And when you have that kind of language coming from the government that's murdered more people than any government on the planet, you really need to be sounding the alarm and taking urgent steps to protect yourself. So getting all this Huawei stuff out of our systems is a good start. But, it's at the point now where we can't fly a lot of our Air Force planes, our military Air Force jets, without components that come from Communist China. And, first of all, these are very low quality already. The Chinese are not exactly known for high quality manufacturing. It's a communist dictatorship. What should we expect, right? And second of all, it's very easy to put, design into these systems tools for espionage, tools for sabotage. They can be controlled remotely. And so, I'm very glad that the Trump administration is working on this. I'm glad that some of these people are now being held accountable, being prosecuted. But we need to see a lot more of that.
Yeah, and that's why we have you guys have the MAGA hats. We have these hats which we got from Taiwan from our editor, which says
nice.
Make China lose again.
That's so awesome. That's brilliant.
So another question we had is about the petition for Donald Trump for war reparations, for World War II war reparations for Poland from Germany and Russia. Did you get a chance to speak with anybody about this? Anybody have told you anything or any feedback from people in America since the petition has started?
Yeah, I talked to my editor at the New American magazine, and we're going to be writing something up about it. We'll be doing a news article just as soon as time opens up and we get the comments that we need. So looking forward to that, and yeah, it's it'll be interesting to see where this goes, and I'm looking forward to hearing back from Pastor Pavel so that we can get this article moving.
Okay,
that's great.
Can you tell us something from United States, something more personal, maybe about what do every American care about daily things that Americans are concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, it really is varies widely. You know, there, unlike a lot of, say, European nations that are very homogeneous, you know, like the Polish people or used to be, you know, the Scandinavian countries, things like that. America really is nowadays composed of a lot of individual communities. And, you know, people and communities that are politically active are already starting to get concerned about the presidential election. You know, we see on the Democratic Party side a bunch of absolute socialists who actually even say openly that they're socialists. So that's a very troubling sign. And depending on what side of the aisle you're on, some people are either excited by that, and I would say that's still a minority at this point, although among the younger people, unfortunately, it's becoming a majority. And among the older people, it's very alarming. You know, anybody who knows anything about the history of socialism looks at this and is horrified. You know, we saw what socialism did in Cuba, right? In my hometown in Miami, we have more than 1 million people who came from Cuba and their descendants running away from socialism. We have, you know, everywhere that it's been tried, you have starvation, horror, death camps, torture. You know, so people who know about socialism are very alarmed by this. We see our country moving in a radical direction as a result of the indoctrination in the schools and the fake news from the media. So the 2020 election is already causing a lot of anxiety, you know, and that's typically what happens as government gets bigger and bigger. You know, when the government gets bigger and controls more and more aspects of everybody's life, then it suddenly becomes much more important who controls that government. When the government is small and doesn't do very much, it doesn't really matter that much. You know, politics isn't such a huge deal. But when suddenly the government controls everything, then everybody needs to try to get a hold of that government to make sure that they don't get squashed in the process. They know that, so it's a big problem. And unfortunately, it's becoming more and more extreme. You know, you now have people talking openly about civil war on national television. You have people recommending that people go out and buy guns. You know, prominent people on prominent national news networks talking like this. And unfortunately, you know, it's not the whole society. You know, a lot of the society is still hypnotized by, you know, what's happening with the sports and who said what in Hollywood and that kind of stuff. But they're essentially irrelevant to the political question. But in the political sphere, you now have really increasing intensity of conflict, of hatred. You know, you have now communists, socialists, anarchists, all these groups coming out of the closet and just, you know, openly trying to tear down the fabric of our society, of our civilization. And this is very concerning, I think, to a lot of people. And there's a very eerie, uncomfortable feeling now. Hopefully, you know, Trump has now, I think, started trying to tone this down. We saw in his State of the Union speech, he really was trying to be conciliatory, try to bring people together, you know, try to sound moderate and try to create a united America. But there are forces that are very deliberately trying to polarize the American people. You have the Communist News Network, I call it. They're the Clinton News Network, aka CNN, is very actively spreading false news and hatred of conservative Americans, of Americans who support Trump, suggesting that they're all, you know, Nazis and Ku Klux Klan and, you know, just want to be racist and all these crazy things that CNN invents in its imagination. And it is not pretty. You know, it's getting more and more ugly. And I think it's going to be getting worse and worse as we head into this 2020 election. So I hope the people of Poland will pray for our country because, you know, it's not a good situation right now, and this is now trickling down to everyday people. You know, families get together for dinner, and the ones who watch CNN just hate the people who, you know, support Trump, and it's yeah, it's not good. It's really not good. I don't want to beat around the bush and paint a rosy picture. Good things are happening, but in the political sphere, it's getting ugly.
Is building of the wall a real concern for society? For example, the wall, because I'm interested in building the wall on the border, southern border.
Yeah, well, you have a lot of people who really support this idea. It's now become a very political question. You had Congress voting on whether to reject Trump's emergency declaration. Of course, Trump can just veto this, so you know it's really more of a symbolic measure. But it goes back to that polarization. You know, Trump has the legal authority to build barriers. There's no question about it. The U.S. law says that the president has the authority to build barriers, to keep out drugs, to keep out human smugglers, things like this for national security. So he is within his authority as defined by our Congress to be doing these things. But it has become now, you know, a situation where one of our major parties, the Democrat Party, is now basically openly trying to dismantle our country, dismantle our border. And so this goes back to what I was just saying a moment ago. It's becoming very polarized. The Democrats and the fake news are trying to paint this wall as some sort of racist thing or some sort of extreme thing, all the while when they're out there promoting racism and extremism and these sorts of things. So what happens with the wall, I think, is still an open question. It's tied up in court, and the Congress, of course, is acting out. But as I understand it, parts of the barrier are being built, and Trump seems pretty determined to do this. So we'll see what ends up happening with it. Even a few good people have kind of questioned the methods here. Senator Rand Paul is really one of the better friends of liberty in Washington, D.C., and even he voted against the emergency declaration because he thinks there's better ways to do this. So it has become a divisive issue, but I think a lot of Americans recognize how important it is. You have the UN talking about they're going to be sending 150 million so-called climate refugees toward the Western world in the coming years. And, there's a very urgent need to take urgent steps to deal with this. And I think, countries like Hungary have led the way in terms of securing their borders. And unfortunately, in the United States, we have a very significant faction of our body politic that does not want to see that happen. They do want open borders. They do want to flood America with people from foreign cultures and with foreign value systems who don't speak the language, because they tend to become Democratic voters. That's why they want this. We just need to be honest and say it. That's what they want. They want a one-party state, and they know that if they can bring in 30, 40 million illegal immigrants and make them voters, they will win every election. So I think that's what's going on here. And it's an effort to kind of undermine the fabric of nations, right? To undermine national identity on the road to globalism. So it's such a huge, broad issue that transcends so many other issues. And I think that's why we're seeing so much resistance to it. So we'll have to see what happens. I think we need to keep following it, and it'll be interesting.
Exactly. And also keep praying, because it's an important part of it. You mentioned that we should pray for America and for your leaders, because they're at the forefront and they set the tone for all the other issues. Well, that's great. Thanks a lot, Alex, for being with us today. By the way, I forgot to mention that we were transmitting live this time, and hopefully continue this as well in the future. Thank you very much for taking time to speak with us. Alex Newman from the NewAmerican magazine and John Birch Society was with us today, and my friend and editor Michal Szczukiewicz, and myself, Ivan Belostenko. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.